do as we're instructed there in Deuteronomy, not merely to rejoice before God with our families, certainly to do that, but also to learn to fear God more fully and more deeply. And we should go with the desire and with the idea of coming away with something that we can use to go forward in our Christian lives. The emphasis was set in Pensacola at the very beginning of the feast about the importance of the way we think in our hearts, of setting proper goals, certainly first and foremost the kingdom of God. And that was focused in upon many other things were focused in upon. And yet, what difference will the things that you learn, what difference will the feast, what difference will any of these things really make in our lives? We've gone through the fall festival season, through the Feast of Trumpets, and the Day of Atonement, and the sermons that we heard here locally. We've gone through all of the sermons of the Feast of Tabernacles and the last great day. And we have undoubtedly, during the course of this time, heard things that have inspired us, that have gotten us maybe stirred up and focused in on our desire to do better, to more closely walk with God and to serve Him. And yet so often, what we all do is we fall back into our regular routine. We fall back into our old paths and our old habits, and there's not nearly as much change that takes place as maybe what we had hoped and desired. Why is it that people do not follow through? Why is it that people don't follow through and really obey God as they ought? You know, the tendency of human beings is to let down. The tendency of human beings is not to walk closely with God in every way. Why is it that we all have the tendency not to follow through as we really ought? Why is it that this happens and occurs so often, and occurs even in our own lives if we're not very, very careful to prevent it? I want to focus our attention on a few chapters here in the book of 1 Kings. And from these examples that are given here in these really 3 chapters, we're going to note 3 things that stand in the way of preventing us from really following through in our obedience to God as we ought. Things that get in our way, that interfere with our obedience to God. There are things that interfered with the obedience of others who've gone before us, and there are things that if we will learn from these examples, they are things that can profit us. You know, the Scripture, when it speaks of God's law, and certainly we are to focus in on God's law, and the festival time is a time for focusing in on the law. We might just note back in Psalm 119 to start off. In Psalm 119, in verse 1, it says, "Blessed are the undefiled in the way who walk in the way of the Lord. Blessed are they that keep His testimonies and that seek Him with whole heart. They also do no iniquity, they walk in His ways. You've commanded us to keep Your precepts diligently. Oh, that my ways were directed to keep Your statutes. Then shall I not be ashamed when I have respect unto all Your commandments. I will praise You with uprightness of heart when I shall have learned Your righteous judgments. I'll keep Your statutes, O forsake me not utterly." And it goes on talking about focusing in on God's law and God's way. Now, God's law, when it talks about walking in the law of the Lord, there are different aspects of the law. The first aspect that is mentioned here in Psalm 119, verse 2, is those who keep His testimony, keep God's testimonies, and seek Him with the whole heart. You know, some people have the idea that the law of God consists simply of the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments are the overall outline of the basic law of God. First and foremost, God's law can be summed up in the word love. God is love, we're told. When Jesus was asked, what is the great commandment of the law? What is the law all about? He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is the first and the great commandment. The second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. On these two. And everything else hangs on those two principles. The Ten Commandments, first four, tell you how to love God with your whole heart. The last six tell you how to love your neighbor as yourself. But some people have the idea that unless you can point to a specific verse that says thou shalt or thou shalt not, that God must not have any laws pertaining to it. Well, the word for law in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew language, the word Torah, was a rather broad, inclusive word that had to do with teaching. It was authoritative teaching, yes, but it was teaching in a broader overall sense. We think of laws as simply a list of rules, but you know, under the Torah, the overall teaching of God, there are various types of laws. There are commandments, such as the 10. There are statutes. There are judgments. There are testimonies. They're precepts. Now, God's testimonies, the word testimony, the English word is derived, same term we get our word testify, or testimony, testament. And it just simply means something that is borne witness to, something that is authoritatively recorded, a story, an example, something that is borne witness to. And that is really the meaning of the word in the Hebrew language as well. The examples and the illustrations that are given in the Old Testament form an important part of the testimonies, an important part of the law of God. If we want to gain God's perspective, then we look not merely at the places that say thou shalt and thou shalt not. We certainly ought to look to those, and that's spelled out. But that's not all there is to the Bible. In many cases, what we have is examples and illustrations, events that are borne record of which testimony is rendered concerning. And these authoritative examples that are set down in the Scriptures give us a way of looking at life and of understanding that is very important. And it is from here in 1 Kings that as we look at what really is a part of the law of God, it's a part of the testimony of God, that we will, I think, discern from these examples, from these 3 chapters, 3 basic reasons why people fail to follow through and obey God as they know they ought. We can pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 11. In 1 Kings chapter 11, we open the story with Solomon getting off the track. Now, I'm not going to get into Solomon's example. There are many places we could go, but I want to focus in on a specific part. Solomon began to get off the track. In verse 9, 1 Kings 11, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned from the eternal God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. Solomon, of course, the more that he became entangled with alliances and relationships with the world around, the more that he wound up compromising the very identity that God had given to him as king of Israel to set him apart. God was angry with Solomon because of his disobedience. And God told him in verse 11 that the kingdom was going to be taken from him. However, for the sake of David, his father, it would not occur in his lifetime. And also, because of the promise God had made to David, it would not occur entirely. That God would rend the kingdom from him, but he would divide the kingdom. And that Solomon's son would be left with just a small portion of the kingdom. We find in verse 14 that the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. And in verse 23, God stirred up another adversary, Rezon, the son of Eliada. And he went to Damascus and dwelt there. In verse 25, he was an adversary to Solomon. And in verse 26, we pick up the story of another man, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He was an Ephrathite of Zereda. He was Solomon's servant. His mother's name was Zeruiah. She was a widow. He lifted up his hand against the king. And this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. So we find three adversaries of Solomon, the third being a man by the name of Jeroboam. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Though for at least a number of years he was reared as he grew up. Father died at some point earlier than this. We're not told when, but given the indication, he was raised by his widowed mother. And he became an adversary to Solomon. Now, this is the way that came about. Solomon built Milo, and he repaired the breaches of the city of David, his father. And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon saw the young man, that he was industrious, and he made him ruler over all of the charge of the house of Joseph. So he was set there in the area of Ephraim, set as the one who was in charge and was Solomon's, emissary, Solomon's sort of like the governor there in that area, responsible to the king over that area, and particularly in the context of some of the tax levies that were being made for some of these building programs that Solomon had going on. He was an industrious young man and had sort of worked his way up from the bottom. Solomon was impressed with him and then promoted him. And in verse 29, it came to pass at the time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way. And he clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on Jeroboam, and he pulled it off, and he tore it into 12 pieces. Now, if you had a new coat and somebody grabbed it and started ripping it into pieces, you may not like that. Jeroboam must have wondered what was going on here. Then Ahijah said to Jeroboam, I want you to take 10 pieces. For thus says the Eternal, the God of Israel, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you. But he'll have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I've chosen. Because that they have forsaken me and worshipped false gods, the gods of the Zidonians and the Moabites and the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, have not kept my statutes. I'm going to do this. Howbeit, I'm not going to take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I'll make him prince all the days of his life. He's going to continue to rule through his lifetime because of David's sake, but I'm going to take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I'm going to give it to you 10 tribes. And unto his son will I give 1 tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem. And I'll take you, and you'll rule according to all that your soul desires, and you will be king over Israel. And if you'll hearken unto all the way that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what's right in my sight, and keep my statutes and my commandments as David did, I will be with you and build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel unto you. Now, Solomon evidently heard about this, and he sought to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, we're told in verse 40, arose and fled to Egypt and hid out there under the protection of the Egyptian king. Verse 42 tells us that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel 40 years, and he died and was buried, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his stead. Rehoboam went to Shechem, which was at that time the place where the kings were crowned. It was, we find, a place that located in Ephraim where Joshua had made his headquarters. It was a place of note in Israel. And we're told that Rehoboam came to Shechem, and all Israel came there to make him king. Now, Jeroboam was in Egypt. He heard of this because he had fled from the presence of Solomon. And he came. And when he heard Solomon had died, he came back to Israel. And Jeroboam, we're told in verse 3, and all the congregation of Israel came and spoke unto Rehoboam. And they said, Your father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make you the grievous service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we'll serve you. So they came and they said, We have a complaint that we want to address to you prior to the coronation. You're coming here to be crowned as king, and we have a complaint about taxes. Your father became a very harsh ruler in some of his latter days. Tax burden was very high. We want you to lighten the load. So they came with a request. Now, Rehoboam said, Well, give me a little time. Give me 3 days to think it over. Right? This is a big decision. First big decision that I've confronted since I stepped into my father's shoes, and I need a little time to think it over. And so he consulted, we're told, with the old men. The men that had stood before Solomon his father when he lived. Men who had been around for a while. Those who had been tried and tested. Men that had been there with Solomon and had seen these things. And said, How do you advise that I may answer this people? And they said, Well, if you will be a servant to the people this day and will serve them, and you will answer them gently, speak good words, they will be your servants forever. They've got a legitimate point, and if you show them that you're willing to listen when they have something of value to say, that you're willing to listen, you're willing to do that, they will appreciate that and they will respond to that. Now, he didn't like that advice. And he forsook the counsel of the old men, and he consulted with the young men that were grown up with him. His buddies. And said, What do you think I ought to say? And they said, Look, you need to let them know who's the boss. You need to make sure they know you're in charge. You need to go out and tell them, say, Look, you think my dad was rough on you? You haven't seen a king. Boy, you don't know what hard is. He chastised you with whips. I'm going to use scorpions. Oh, I'm going to be a lot rougher than he was. You guys better do what I say because I'm running things. They really laid it on thick. In verse 11, he said, Now whereas my father laid you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. I'm going to be rougher than my dad ever thought about being. Now, Jeroboam and the people came to Rehoboam the third day as he had appointed, and the king answered the people roughly. He forsook the old men's counsel, and he spoke after the counsel of the young men. And the king listened not to the people. Verse 15. Now God had allowed this, that this prophecy might come to pass. In verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, the people answered the king and said, What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. So Israel rebelled. And Israel rebelled, verse 19, against the house of David unto this day. Children of Israel, Rehoboam reigned in Judah, but they didn't crown him there in Shechem. And when he sent his tax collector in verse 18 up to collect the taxes, they stoned him, and he died. And so King Rehoboam, verse 18, made speed to get into his chariots and to flee to Jerusalem. He decided he better get out of there. And when Israel heard that Jeroboam was come, they sent and they called and they made him king. None followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Now get the picture here. Here is the 12 tribes. Here's Solomon, who's king over the whole nation. He dies. Rehoboam is to be king. Rehoboam is standing there. But what's his problem? Why does Rehoboam do what he did? I think one of the problems that Rehoboam had, as so often someone has when they're sort of living under the shadow of someone previous, Rehoboam was under his father's shadow. You know, Solomon had cast a long shadow. Solomon was a man of renown, known throughout the world. He had a worldwide reputation. He was noted for many, many things. And for 40 years he had been king. Now 40 years is a long time. That means you've got plenty of people who never even remember when there was another king. You know, you'd be looking at people who have to be probably 50 and up to really have much memory of a time when Solomon wasn't king. So Rehoboam knows from the beginning that he's going to be compared to his father. And in his mind, he's comparing himself to his father, and he's chafing at those comparisons, and he's out to impress. He's out to impress. He wants everyone to know how great and how important he is. He's out to impress everyone. And because he's out to impress them, he makes a very fatal mistake. Now, he must have sort of chafed at the fact that he couldn't quite impress some of the older men that had been around longer than he had and had worked with Solomon and were sort of the contemporaries of his father. He must have chafed a little bit under the fact that he couldn't really impress them, that these men had been in on things that he hadn't. They had a great deal of experience that he didn't have. And they gave him some advice, and he chafed under that because it was like, well, you seem to think that my dad could be rough on them and they would do it, and I come along and they won't. Well, you know, I want everybody to know how great I am and how tough I am. What a great king I am. He chafed at that because he was out to impress others. You know, the Scripture tells us that God will exalt the humble, but all that walk in pride he is able to abase. When we set out to impress others, we set ourselves up for serious trouble. Rehoboam set out to impress everyone as to what a great, powerful king he was. And he wound up impressing them all right, but not in the way that he had in mind. You know, when someone is motivated by a competitive desire to try and be as good as somebody else and to try to impress everyone, they often will do things that have a tendency to backfire, because that's not a way that's going to lead us in the paths of righteousness. You know, part of what we gain here from the testimony concerning Rehoboam is the dangers of setting out trying to impress. Setting out trying to impress. Because God says, "To this man will I look, to him that's humble and of a contrite spirit and that trembles at my word." He says that he will give grace to the humble, but that he will resist the proud. Rehoboam set out to impress everyone. He forsook the counsel and the advice of others who had been around for a longer time, because nobody was going to tell him anything. He knew. And he had this sort of competitive approach to measure up and surpass his father, to surpass Solomon's record. He wanted everybody to know that he was the king. Well, he wound up king of only a fraction of the nation. And he wouldn't have even had that had it not been for God's mercy. He was going to show them, and ultimately wound up being an example, but not in the way that he had in mind. So, the first thing that we run up against, the first thing that we take note of here, is the dangers of setting out to impress. When you set out to impress someone, when you set out to impress others, you want to make sure that they know who you are. When your motive and your goal, you're trying to impress somebody, you are headed off the track. That is not a motive that will lead you in the paths of righteousness. That will not lead you in a closer walk with God and in closer obedience to God. That led Rehoboam astray. His desire to impress. He wanted others to view him as important, as a great king. He felt competitive with his father's reputation. Perhaps a little jealous of the respect and the awe in which people had held King Solomon. And because of that, he wanted people to think he was important. And he was powerful, and he was a great king. And instead of looking powerful, he simply wound up looking ridiculous. He set out trying to impress others. A very foolish mistake. Now, let's go on, because we pick up at this point the life of another man, a man whose life was greatly intertwined with that of Rehoboam, a man by the name of Jeroboam. Now, we read that in verse 20 here of 1 Kings 12, that when all Israel heard Jeroboam was come again, they called him to the congregation, and they made him king over all Israel. And there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Now Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, and he assembled out of Judah and portions of Benjamin, because Jerusalem itself was actually in the territory of Benjamin. God was going to preserve Jerusalem for the house of David and going to preserve the house of David. And so Rehoboam rather, held on to Judah and to a portion there of Benjamin. He got back and he assembled an army. God sent a word and told him to not, in verse 24, to go out to fight against the children of Israel. And this time they listened and they went home. Now, in verse 25, Jeroboam built Shechem and Mount Ephraim and dwelt there. And he went out from thence and he built Phanuel. He fortified a fortress city, and he built up Shechem, the ancient city of Joshua, built that up as his capital. Now, time went on, and of course, right after the split in the nation, political feeling was high, and everybody was upset, and there was all of the tension and the excitement in the air. But of course, what happens? Weeks go by, months go by, people get back to routine business, day in and day out. For a while, everybody was all excited. Boy, we showed him, we got a new king, we're going to do all this, and taxes are going to be lowered, and they've got the right man in. But you know what so often happens? We're having an election right now, and in the aftermath of the election, there are going to be people that are all going to be excited, and they just know that the problems are going to be solved, and they got their man in. And, a few months from now, they're going to be griping about the new guy and about what he's done. And I can't believe that. Oh, this guy, look what he's done. I don't care which one of them gets in. There are going to be people that voted for him. They're going to be griping. In fact, you may have trouble finding anybody that voted for him. That's sort of like looking for Edwin Edwards supporters in Louisiana now. You look around sometimes for after an election, somebody gets in and starts doing the things they do, and then you wonder how in the world he ever got in, because nobody seems to have voted for him. Well, people get preoccupied with their own routine things, and they begin to grumble, and Jeroboam began to get nervous. Things settled down. All of the excitement of the new king and the new coronation and the new nation, all of that began to settle down, and people got preoccupied with making a living. And they began to gripe and grumble because all of a sudden they found out that having a new king didn't mean all the problems went away. And there were still the same difficulties and still the same things. And so Jeroboam began to get worried. He became a little anxious and a little fearful. He became worried. In verse 26, he said, "Now shall the kingdom return to the house of David." When he began to realize that people were voicing their complaints and people were back to just being people, he began to get concerned and think, I wonder if I'm going to stay king very long. I wonder how long it's going to be before they get tired of me and they want to reunite and go back to having Jerusalem as the capital and to having the house of David rule over them. Verse 27, "If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people be turned again unto their Lord to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they'll kill me and go again to Rehoboam." He began to worry, and he said, the feast is coming up. And people are going to be going up to Jerusalem, and they're going to be excited, and they're going to be there, and the priesthood will be there. And Rehoboam the king, because he rules in Jerusalem, he'll be there. And everybody throughout the nation will be in Jerusalem. And Rehoboam will open the feast. And people are going to begin to sort of long for the good old days. And I'm going to wind up and lose out. He was afraid. He was afraid that he was going to lose what he wanted. Because you see, what he wanted was power. He wanted to be king and to establish his dynasty. He really, really wanted that. And he was afraid that he was going to lose it. Verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel. Now, again, he took counsel from the wrong source. Because as a result of his getting advice, he decided to make 2 calves of gold. And he told the people, he said, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. That's a long ways. That's inconvenient. That's difficult. That's too far to go. Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set up the one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now, Bethel is down in the southern part of the nation, and Dan is up in the northern part. So he said, look, we need to make things a little more convenient. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have 2 places you can go. You can take your choice. You don't have to make that a long trip all the way to Jerusalem. You can go to Dan if you live up there, or you can go to Bethel if you live down there. Take your choice. Just, go to the church of your choice, whichever one you want, Dan or Bethel. This thing became a sin because the people went to worship. Dan became the primary center, but they went there to worship. That was sinful. In verse 31, he made a house of high places. So not only did he create the 2 false temples, the one at Dan and one at Bethel, where he set the 2 golden calves, but now throughout the nation, he set what are called high places, which were like groves of oak trees, where there was a local priest. So it was a matter that there were places all over the nation you could worship, and then at feast time you could go to either Dan or Bethel. And he established that, which was totally different than what God had. And he made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. Because, you see, he wanted a priesthood that would do what he told them. He wanted a priesthood that would preach what he said. And the Levites knew the law and were schooled in the law. He wanted people that were not well schooled in the law, people that were out looking for a job, and they would do what he said. That they would be obligated to him. So he put in different priests. Verse 32, Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and he offered unto the altar, upon the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made. He placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. He offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart. He ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered on the altar and burned incense. Now, he changed the feast. When does God's feast come? Remember, Leviticus 23? The Feast of Tabernacles begins on the 15th day of the 7th month. Jeroboam changed the feast. He said, let's have it on the 8th month. It gets hectic and you're trying to get all the harvest in and everything. Let's make it more convenient. We'll just move it back. Boy, up in northern Israel, our harvest runs a little bit later anyway, and it's pretty hectic trying to get all that in and get to Jerusalem. He said, we have a couple of other places, and we'll just celebrate the feast in the 8th month. Now, it's interesting. Old sins cast long shadows. A lot of people are going to be celebrating a feast in the 8th month a week from now. You know what the word October means? It means 8th month. Octopus, something with 8 arms, an octagon, that's an 8-sided figure. The oct, O-C-T prefix, means 8. October means 8th month, just like December means 10th month. We get our word decimal and things of that sort. You see, the old Roman calendar actually had its beginnings with the new year being March 1st. It began in more the spring season. And that's why the month September means seventh month. That's why in the Roman calendar, November means ninth month. So the last 4 months of the old Roman calendar carry their earlier Roman names. Others were named for various gods and various things. July, of course, Julius Caesar named after himself. When Augustus Caesar came along, he named the next one after himself. That's why you've got the sequence. Have you ever noticed how all the months are 30, 31, 30, 31? And when you get to July and August, you have two 31-day months back to back. You know why that is? When Augustus Caesar named the month after himself, August, it was a 30-day month. And he said, that's no good. That makes my Uncle Julius look more important than me. His month's longer than mine. I'm going to add an extra day to mine. Mine will be just as long as his. And so he had to take it away from somewhere, so he took it away from February. And that's why February wound up shorter than the others. Because he didn't want one named after him that was shorter than somebody else's. So thankfully, all the others didn't come along. Everybody named the next one after themselves. We could have wound up with no telling what. But sort of an interesting aside, and this is not the main thrust I want to get into here, but I think it is a little bit interesting to know because we're going to be confronted with Halloween next week. That if you look up Halloween in the encyclopedia, it reads you a little bit what it says out of the old 11th edition Britannica on Halloween. Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, the name given to the 31st of October as the Vigil of Hallow Mass, or All Saints' Day. Though now known as little else but the eve of the Christian festival, Halloween and its former attendant ceremonies long predate Christianity. You see, this was the time when the Druids held their great autumn festival. They lighted fires in honor of the sun god and thanksgiving for the harvest. Now, does that sort of remind you of the Feast of Tabernacles, a period of thanksgiving, the Feast of Ingathering, the thanksgiving for the harvest? Only it wasn't in honor of the great God, the Creator. It was in honor of the sun god. The Druids celebrated their great autumn festival in the 8th month. And they lit fires in honor of the sun god, thanksgiving for the harvest. The main celebrations of Halloween, we're told, were purely Druidical, in other words, derived from the Druids. Now, who are the Druids? Well, we're told from the Druids, this is taken from Lempriere's Classical Dictionary, the Druids were the ministers of religion among the ancient Gauls and Britons. They were held in the greatest veneration by the people. They were entrusted with the education of the youth, and with all religious ceremonies, festivals, and sacrifices were under their peculiar care. They laid great emphasis there. They held sway under the oak trees, in groves of oak trees. And they were the priestly class. We're told that Britain was the headquarters of Druidism, but there was a general assembly of the order once a year in Gaul. Now, what you find, of course, when you do a little bit of research into it, what happened to the descendants of northern Israel over whom Jeroboam ruled? What happened to them? Well, about 200 years after what we're reading right now, about 200 years later, they went into captivity. The Assyrians took them into captivity, and then they migrated up into, after that, they migrated up into northern Europe, known as the Celtic people. And where do we find among the Gauls, the Britons, the ancient Celtic peoples, what do we find? We find the Druids celebrating a great harvest festival in the autumn, known, or that's come down to us, as Halloween. And even the focus there of a time when all the spirits of all the dead would come up out of the graves is nothing but a perversion of the last great day. You know, what you have is a pagan perversion of God's festival that has come all the way down, preserved down through the descendants of these people. So old sins can cast long shadows. And we come all the way down to the paganism of today, which is nothing but a shadow of the paganism of the past. Now, Jeroboam established his festival in the 8th month, and he established his new priesthood, and he set up his idolatrous temples. Why did Jeroboam do that? Because he was afraid of losing his kingdom. You see, not only does trying to impress others cause us to get off the track and not really follow through with what we ought to do, fear of consequences. Jeroboam took the way that seemed right to him because he was afraid. He looked at it and he said, you know, if these people go down to Jerusalem, they're going to begin to orient back to Jerusalem and Rehoboam, and it won't be long before I lose my kingdom. Now, Proverbs tells us there is what God says do, it won't work. We're afraid of the consequences. And our fear of the consequences causes us to try and do it our own way. Now, Jeroboam did a way that he thought would ensure the kingdom forever. But it didn't. God had told Jeroboam, He said, I'm going to give you this kingdom, and if you obey me and really serve me as David did, then I will establish your dynasty as well over Israel. But you see, Jeroboam got scared because he didn't see how God could do it. People get scared because they lose their focus on God and they get their focus on people. And when we get our focus on people and we lose sight of God and start looking at people, we begin to become impressed with people, and we're fearful of what people are going to do, and our focus and our attention and our mind is wrapped up in people, and we begin to maneuver and manipulate, trying to protect ourselves. You know, when the Scripture says, he that seeks to save his life shall lose it, but he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. The point is that if my top priority is saving my hide, I'm going to lose my hide. If my top priority is obeying God, God will save my hide. But if my top priority is saving my hide, and God gets left out of the picture, then I'm going to find that I can't save me. Jeroboam's top priority was preserving his throne and his fear. Because it sounded reasonable. Why? These people start going up to Jerusalem year after year, and pretty soon they're going to get tired of me. You know, the tendency of human nature, of course, is always to, what do people want? They hanker for a change. They get tired and they're griping about what they have, and they think, somebody else will do better. That's what happens. We have the cycles in our country, the two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and over the course of time, it goes back and forth. One will be in power for a while, and people get disgusted with that, and they think, boy, what we need is a change. And so they get the other bunch in there, and after a while, they get disgusted with them. They forget how disgusted they were with the previous bunch, so they go back to them, and they go back and forth over a period of time. once enough time has passed, that people have sort of forgotten what the last bunch was like. Jeroboam looked at that and he was afraid. He figured people were going to get tired of him. They would begin to have nostalgia for the house of David. And so he set out to solve the problem his own way. It seemed reasonable to him. But you see, he left God out of the picture. Because just because he didn't see how God could do it, he decided he'd have to fix it. Brethren, whether or not you and I see how God can do it is totally irrelevant. I don't have to see how God can do it for God to see how God can do it. Why should our limitations be construed as a limit to God? Because we can't figure out how God's going to solve a problem. Does that mean God's hands are tied? God could have solved this problem that Jeroboam had many ways. Well, as we come on into chapter 13, there came a man of God out of Judah. By the word of the Lord, he came to Bethel. And Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. And he cried against the altar in the word of the Lord, and he said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. Now this is something that was to occur. Josiah was born about 250 years after this event. So here is a man named by name over 250 years prior to his birth. This man of God said, a child is going to be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon this altar he is going to offer the priests of the high places that burn incense unto you, and men's bones shall be burned unto you. And he gave a sign, and he said, this is the sign that the Lord has spoken, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes poured out. Now when Jeroboam heard this, he cried out and said, lay hold on him. And his hand that he put forth when he said, lay hold on him, he couldn't pull it to him again. All of a sudden his hand crippled up. The altar was rent and the ashes poured out. And the king was scared. Because all of a sudden he couldn't use his hand. And the king answered to the man of God, and he said, entreat now the face of the Lord, and pray for me that my hand may be restored. And the man of God besought the Lord, and the king's hand was restored. And the king said unto the man of God, come home with me and refresh yourself, and I'll give you a reward. And the man of God said to the king, if you give me half your house, I won't come home with you. Neither will I eat bread or drink water in this place. For so was it charged me by the word of the Lord, saying, eat no bread nor drink water, nor turn again by the same way that you came. He said, no, I can't do that. God specifically instructed me when I came here that I was to come, give the message, and go straight back home. I was not to eat bread or drink water in this place. I have very specific instructions. I can't go to your house. So God had given quite a warning here to Jeroboam. We'll find out it didn't do Jeroboam a whole lot of good. Let's notice here this man of God, this prophet. In verse 10, he went back another way. He returned not by the way that he came to Bethel. Now there dwelt an old prophet in Bethel. A false prophet, in reality. An old prophet in Bethel. And his sons came and told him all the works that the man of God had done that day in Bethel. The words which he had spoken unto the king, they told to their father. And their father said, what way did he go? Now the sons had seen the way that the man of God went, the one that came from Judah. And so he told his sons to saddle up his donkey, and he got on it and rode. And he went after the man of God, and he found him sitting under an oak tree. And he said, are you the man of God that came from Judah? And he said, yes. And he said, well, I want you to come home with me and eat. And he said, "No, I can't return with you, nor go in with you. Neither will I eat bread or drink water with you in this place. For it was said unto me by the word of the Lord, You shall eat no bread nor drink water, nor turn again to go by the way that you came." And he said to him, the old man said, "I'm a prophet also. I'm a prophet just like you are. An angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord and said, Bring him back with you into your house, that he may eat bread and drink water." But he lied unto him. He lied. Well, it's really easy to say, "Oh, God said so and so." He lied. The prophet went back with him, and he ate bread in his house, and he drank water. It came to pass, as they sat at the table, the word of the Lord came to the prophet. And he cried unto the man of God that came from Judah, and said, "Thus says the Lord, Forsomuch as you have disobeyed the mouth of the Lord, and have not kept the commandment which the Lord your God commanded you, but came back and have eaten bread and drunk water in the place which God said, Don't, your carcass shall not come to the sepulchre of your fathers. You're not going to go back home and be buried in the family plot." It came to pass when he ate and drank, he saddled up his ass and left. And when he was gone, verse 24, a lion met him and slew him. And the donkey just stood there, and the lion just stood there. The lion didn't eat the carcass, and the donkey didn't run off. And this was quite a remarkable thing, and word got around that there was a dead man laying out there by the trail, and the donkey was standing there by him, and the lion was standing there by him. And you don't see that sort of thing very often, because the lion would, under normal circumstances, have proceeded on to the man and the donkey. And the donkey wouldn't have stayed around to see what happened to the man. But this was quite a remarkable thing. Word got around. And verse 26, the prophet that brought him back heard it, and he said, "That's got to be the man of God, who was obedient to the word of the Lord, and who was disobedient to the word of the Lord. And the Lord has delivered him unto the lion." So he told his sons to get the donkey ready, and he saddled up and went off, and sure enough, he found him. And he took the carcass, verse 29, of the man of God, brought it back to the city, and he buried it. And he buried it there in his own tomb, and had a big funeral, big production. And then he gave his sons instruction and said, "When I'm dead, bury me here, and lay my bones beside his bones." Now there was a reason for that, and we won't go back to Chronicles to read the details, but what, of course, happened was this prophecy that Josiah would come in and would take all the bones of the false prophets and would burn them on the altar, and would level the altar, would desecrate the graves of the false prophets. This old false prophet decided he was going to be smart. He was going to have himself buried there with the true prophet, and his grave wouldn't be disturbed. And he thought that was really going to be, he was really going to do something with that, so that's what he did. Now, what do we get from here? Here we find a very tragic and a very serious mistake. Here was a man that was used of God, a man that God raised up and sent to do His work, sent to Bethel with a message to Jeroboam the king. He delivered that message in a very forthright way. And God had given him specific instructions. He said, when you get through, go back where you came from. Go back a different route and don't stop to eat or drink or visit with anybody. What messed him up? He wound up listening to people instead of listening to God. He wound up listening to people instead of listening to God. Have you ever gone against your better judgment? You ever done something you knew, sort of deep down you knew you probably shouldn't have, but somebody talked you into it? After all, everybody else is doing it. They're doing it. So-and-so said it was okay, and so-and-so said he heard that somebody else said that was fine. And so you figure, well, I guess, they say it's okay. I guess maybe I ought to do it too. Is God pleased when we listen to people instead of listening to Him? You know, if God tells us something, then we need to do what God says. And it doesn't matter who comes along and says, oh, you don't need to do that. Why not? Now, this false prophet, this old prophet came along, and he came to the man of God and said, you don't need, God sort of had second thoughts. And He decided maybe He was giving you too rigorous an instructions, tell you to go all the way back and not stop to eat or drink. He sort of eased things up a little bit and says, well, you can stop off and have dinner at my house. I suspect that the man of God was by this time a little hungry, a little thirsty, feeling kind of lank. And that was a welcome idea. He'd already stopped to rest. He was tired and it was hot and he was undoubtedly thirsty. He didn't relish the idea of the hours that lay ahead of him. Many of you have ever traveled by donkey. You know that that's not a real fast method of transportation. I used to have a donkey when I was growing up, and I never could get him to go very fast at all. He never seemed to quite get the picture. They have a mind of their own. And sometimes their mind is not what your mind is. They don't want to do what you want them to do. And at the best of times, they're not a very fast method of transportation. So here he was, and he knew that he had hours ahead of him. And this guy comes along and says, hey, you can come on to my house. It's okay. God told me it was fine. And he listened. Sometimes what people tell us sounds sort of nice. It's convenient. It sounds like it'd be a little easier, and why not? So people wind up listening to people instead of listening to God. Instead of following God's instructions to the letter, to the T. God says do something, do it. If He says don't do it, don't do it. It is important that we look here and get the lesson that's involved. Here was a man that God had used. Here was a man that did a remarkable work. And yet, he came to a tragic end. He got off the track by listening to people instead of continuing to follow God. Now, as we look at the story of Rehoboam, as we look at the story of Jeroboam, as we look at the story of this man of God, we can realize that there are lessons that are here for each of us. Why is it that we don't sometimes follow through and obey God as we ought? What changes, what good intentions have we had in our life that never quite came about? If you come back from the feast with good intentions, things that you're going to do, have you had good intentions in times past? As we take stock of ourselves, as we have completed the festival cycle through the spring and the fall festivals, and as we go about our business of living life and on a day in and day out basis, are we going to be following in the paths of righteousness? Are we going to be following in ways that take us closer and closer to God? That bring us walking in harmony with God? God wants us to do that, and we can do that with His help, with the power of His Spirit. But at the point that we start trying to impress others, and we become concerned about what others are thinking and trying to impress others, in any sort of context, that leads into a competitive spirit. It leads into a spirit that messed up Rehoboam. He set out to impress everybody, and he made a mess of things. You know, God exalts the humble. He gives grace to the humble. But all that walk in pride, He's able to abase. When we set out to impress, we're setting ourselves up to be abased by God, and we're setting ourselves up for disobedience. Sometimes we set out wanting to do what we ought to do, but we become afraid of the consequences. We look at things that become a little bit overwhelming, a little bit frightening. We get scared of what the results may be. And our fear of the consequences causes, just like it caused Jeroboam, to do what we ought not do. The things that Jeroboam did trying to save himself, you know, by the time you get to the end of the next chapter, you find out Jeroboam's family, Jeroboam's reign, or the reign of his family, didn't last very long at all. It was over with in just a matter of very short time after his death. Jeroboam didn't last, and his family didn't last. The very thing that he feared came upon him in terms of losing his kingdom. Our fear of the consequences can cause us to compromise because we lose sight of God and get our eyes on people. And thirdly, when we start listening to people instead of listening to God, we're setting ourselves up for disaster. You know, John said, the Apostle John wrote in the New Testament, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they be of God." We're told in the book of Isaiah, you know, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it's because there's no truth in them. God does not contradict Himself. You know, the prophet should have realized that. God doesn't contradict Himself. When God gives instructions, it's our responsibility to follow through with those instructions and not to be spending our time looking for sort of an easier, softer way. But seek to follow through, to look for God's way, to listen to God. God desires for us to walk in His ways. We're told that one of the purposes of God's festivals is to focus us on His laws and His ways, and to help us learn to fear Him more fully and more completely. That's the approach that we need in our lives, as we focus in on the ways of God and allow God's Word to be a lamp to our feet and a light to our path.